Chapter 9, Calypso's Prisoner. We sailed out of the straits with the hideous yelping of the Scylla still ringing in our ears and returned our ship east toward home. We intended to skirt the southern tip of the mainland and wait for a fair wind to carry us across the Adriatic Sea. We were prepared to wait for as long as necessary. We wanted to be absolutely sure that nothing went wrong now. Sadly for us, the gods had other ideas. As soon as we swung out into the open sea, fierce easterly winds and currents drove us back toward Thrinacia. We hauled in the sails, and I urged my comrades to row for their lives, but they were no match for the elements. As the afternoon wore on, their heads began to droop, and the tempo of their oar strokes slowly dropped. The elements drove us back, and still I urged my men on in desperation now. They were exhausted. It was Eurylochus who finally spoke out for them and demanded that we turn back. Reluctantly, I agreed. With a heavy heart, I ordered my crew to turn the boat around. We pulled up the sails, and now the wind swept us toward the Thrinacian coast. My men joked that once again we were sailing in the wrong direction, but I did not share their laughter. I sat apart in the stern, and I stared at our wake. It was quickly lost in the choppy water, and this, for some reason, added to my sense of impending doom. By the time we reached the island, the sun had already sunk behind the mountains, and the light was fading fast. We sailed straight into the beautiful cove, sheltered by tall cliffs. My comrades leaped into the shallows and dragged our boat up onto the sand. The sound of bleating and lowing had reached us from across the water, and now in the twilight we could make out the shapes of sheep and cattle moving around on the hillside. On the ridge, their silhouettes stood out against the sky. My men began to lick their lips. It had been a long, grueling day, and they were looking forward to a feast. Right away, I jumped up onto the boat that lay beside us, and I pulled out my sword to back up my words. My friends, listen to me now and listen well. I spoke slowly, letting my gaze rest on each of the faces below me. This is the famous island of Thrinacia, which belongs to Hyperion, god of the sun. Here his sheep and cattle graze, 7 herds of 50 cows and 7 flocks of 50 sheep. These animals are his pride and joy, and if you touch them, then your next voyage will be your last. Both Tiresias and Circe have foretold it. You must swear a solemn oath to leave these beasts alone. My men had no wish to anger the gods and quickly swore the oath. Then we took cured hams and cheese, fruit and wine from our ship's shallow hold, and made a fire on the beach to ward off the night chill. We ate hungrily after the day's exertions and drank to the souls of our lost comrades. As they drank, my men began to weep, and as they wept, sweet sleep overcame them. I, however, remained dried-eyed and alert. I stared into the glowing embers of the fire and prayed for a fair wind to carry us home. My prayers went unanswered. By dawn, a violent storm had blown up, and we gazed in dismay at the turbulent sea. The wind reached gale force, and huge waves crashed into the rocks at the entrance to our cove, throwing great sheets of spray high over the cliff tops. We would have to wait a few days at least, that much was clear. To begin with, we waited patiently enough. We had Circe's supplies to feed us and her fragrant wine to keep our spirits up. The days passed and the storm settled down. Now we waited for the wind to change. But the days slowly turned into weeks, and the strong southeasterly wind continued to blow. We watched our supplies steadily dwindle, and the worm of anxiety gnawed at our minds. A month passed, and still the southeasterly wind blew. Now our supplies were finished, and it was the worm of hunger that gnawed at our insides. We scoured the rocks for crabs and shellfish and made hooks and lines to fish in the sea, but the little we caught only teased our appetites and made our hunger worse. Then we roamed the wooded hills of Thrinacia in search of game, but there was none to be found, and all around us Hyperion's golden cattle and snow-white sheep grazed peacefully while we starved. Even when we sat on the beach and looked out to sea away from the hills, the sound of lowing cattle and bleating sheep was always in our ears. My men were at the end of their line. As a last resort, I left my companions on the beach and walked up into the nearby hills, weak from hunger and lack of sleep. I struggled on until I reached the highest ridge. From the summit, I had a commanding view of the southeast coastline and back across the island to the central mountain range. It was a holy place. I knelt down and bared my soul to the gods. while the sun went down over the distant mountains. Then soft sleep crept up behind me and took me unaware. When I awoke, the sun was already high in the sky. My long sleep had refreshed me, and my hunger seemed to have miraculously disappeared. On my way back down to the beach, I realized that the wind had at last changed. I thought that our trials were over. The wind was now blowing down from the hills. I only smelled the roasting flesh when I came to the beach. In spite of my warnings and in breach of their solemn promise, my men had helped themselves to Hyperion's cattle. "Noble Odysseus," said Eurylochus, who was the first to see me, "don't be dismayed. We know this is forbidden meat, but what choice did we have? We've made sufficient sacrifices to the gods and promised to build Hyperion a magnificent temple if we're allowed to return home safely." Too dismayed to be angry, I buried my face in my hands. If only I had stayed on the beach. Surely I could have persuaded my companions to wait just one more day. By now, we could have left the shores of Thrinacia far behind. Instead, my men had broken divine law and could expect no mercy. Hyperion would have his revenge. There was a sudden gasp from my companions. I looked up to see the carcasses of the slaughtered cattle writhe and shiver on the sand. At the same time, the meat that my men were already roasting on the spits began to bellow like cattle in pain. The gods had spoken, and my men were seized with terror. They begged me to leave the island at once. "Whether we stay or go makes no difference now," I replied, "but since you wish to go, then let us go." Without another word, we dragged our ship down to the water, raised the mast and sails, and rowed away from the shore. The slaughtered cattle still lay writhing on the sand, and the bellows of the roasting meat echoed around the cove as we sailed out into the open sea. Hardly had the sound faded behind us when black clouds massed overhead and a sudden tempest whipped up the sea. Clinging to the mast, I looked up to see great Zeus himself burst out of the clouds with an arm raised high above his head. In the next moment, his arm came down and hurled his dreaded thunderbolt straight at our ship. The vessel exploded, and those men not killed by the blast were drowned. I alone survived, but it seemed that I had only been saved for a more horrible end. I had clung to the mast as the ship broke up around me, and it kept me afloat in the seething water. The storm soon abated, but our old friend the southeasterly wind now returned to drive me back to the wicked straits of Scylla and Charybdis. All through the night that same wind blew, and when morning came, I saw the dreaded cliffs around me. Before I knew it, I was racing toward the small cliff. I was just feet away when the water began churning. Charybdis was sucking her whirlpool in. I clung to the mast and shut my eyes. There was nothing I could do. Seconds later, the far end was sucked down with such violence that I was catapulted high up into the branches of the fig tree that grows out of the cliff. Now I could see right down to the bottom of the whirlpool where the horrible monster lay. Her vast tentacles swirled the water around, and her bulbous octopus eyes stared greedily up, waiting for me to fall. But I held on and waited for 1 hour, then another, and still she sucked the whirlpool in. Finally, Charybdis could hold it in no longer, and with a great gush, the undigested contents of her belly flew into the air around me. As soon as the water had settled, I dived and swam furiously away from the cliff. The mast was floating in the middle of the straits, and I managed to grab hold of it once more. Now I was within reach of the cruel Scylla, but Zeus must have been watching over me. A powerful current carried me out of the straits before she sensed that I was there. For 9 days and nights I drifted with the currents. They took me around the southeast headland of Thrinacia, but although I was parched and hungry, I dared not set foot on those fateful shores again. Then the currents carried me slowly west, farther and farther away from my long-lost home. On the 10th morning, I was finally washed up on an unknown shore. I was too weak to move, and my throat was too dry to utter a sound. I lay on the burning sand beneath the cruel sun, waiting to die. Then I must have passed out, because Calypso told me later that she had found me lying on the beach, unconscious and half dead. She dragged me back to her cavern of marble and gold and nursed me back to life. I opened my eyes to see the lovely nymph staring down at me. her braided hair falling toward my face. She had laid me on a bed of the softest down, covered my burned, cracked skin with cold, wet cloths, and poured cool spring water between my parched lips. I tried to speak, but no words came out. She placed a finger over my mouth and smiled her lovely smile. I gazed at her in wonder until I fell into a deep sleep. I slept long and often over the following weeks as I gradually regained my strength. When I was awake, Calypso would sit by my bed while I recounted the story of Troy and told her of my ill-fated journey home. I learned in turn that she was an immortal nymph who lived alone on her island, Ogygia. Her father was Atlas, the Titan who holds up the sky. She had been warned of my arrival, for my fame went before me even among the gods. She said that I should stay with her until I had fully recovered. Soon it was clear that she wanted me to stay much longer. Calypso had fallen in love with me and offered me the gift of eternal life if I would live with her forever. It is hard to refuse a goddess, but I longed for Ithaca and Penelope, my wife. I pleaded with her to let me go, but she would not give me up, and so my life with Calypso began. 1 year passed, and then another. Every morning I went down to the beach on the eastern shore of Ogygia and looked over the sea, pining for my home. Meanwhile, Calypso sat at her loom in her sumptuous cavern in the woods and sang in a voice like Circe's as she wove her beautiful cloths. Every evening, while the sun set behind me on the far side of the island, I made my way wearily back through the cypress woods to the enchanted grove in front of Calypso's cavern. Here, vines and wild roses grew in abundance, and hidden among them nightingales sang. Small grassy meadows, thick with wildflowers, sloped down to clear streams fed by the crystal waters of the 4 springs that bubbled up in the grove. It was a heavenly place, fit for a god, and Calypso was more beautiful than any mortal woman. But it was not my home, and deep in my heart I was sad. 7 years passed, and still I yearned for Ithaca. Then one evening I returned from the beach to find Calypso sobbing on her bed, her face buried in the pillows. I put out a hand to comfort her, but she flinched away from my touch. I sat beside the bed and waited. At last she turned her face toward me, pale and red-eyed. "Dear, brave Odysseus," she said in a trembling voice, "rejoice. You have your wish at last. Great Zeus has ordered me to let you go, and though it breaks my heart, I must obey him." She took me in her arms and held me close, as though she would never let me go. At dawn, Calypso brought me a bronze axe, an adze, and a box of finely balanced tools. Then she took me to a place where a forest of silver firs rose tall and straight into the sky. I began working immediately. During the days that followed, I felled 20 of the finest trees, cleaned them, and cut timber down to size. I shaped the wood and pegged and jointed the pieces together. When I had finished, I had a small boat to use for my journey home. Calypso brought me cloth for the sail and rope for the braces and halyards, and I was ready to set out to sea. It was early dawn when Calypso led me down to the beach and helped me load my boat with water, food, and wine. Then I took her hand and asked her to understand my desire to grow old and die with my wife and family around me. Neither the beauty of a goddess nor the promise of immortality could ever mean as much to me. She smiled sadly and shook her head. "I will never understand the ways of men. Go now. May Zeus watch over you, for I wish you well. If you keep the great bear to your left, you will steer a true course for home." With these words, she turned away from me and disappeared forever through the trees.